So for those of you that don't know what this is, or if this is your first time showing up, I'm just going to give you a quick 2-minute spiel as to what the goals of this class are. So this is the 3rd year of Hard Earth, and this was pretty much started to look at the various environmental challenges that are going on globally. So typically, we often look at environmental challenges kind of in one field based upon what our current field of studies are, and I definitely know that I've done that in the past. Being an engineer, I look at things from a technical perspective. So what we wanted to do with this class is look at all of the different types of fields that are dealing with environmental problems. So whether that's art history, psychology, journalism, or law. So what we did with this class is to look at the various fields involved. We invite Stanford graduate students from all over campus to come and give talks about their research and the cool problems that they're dealing with. So we also hope that this is going to be a good forum for those undergrads that might be thinking about pursuing a graduate degree, to be able to interact with grad students, seeing that we're not just holed up in our offices all day, and see that this is a potential career path for you to go, and that often it's not linear. So people will study one thing in undergrad and then study something very different in grad school, and their types of backgrounds they often end up using to solve environmental issues again, whether they're looking at it from a local context or a global context. So today I'm excited to invite Hajin to come speak about the work that she does. So she is both in the Stanford Law School and pursuing a PhD, so she is very qualified. So please welcome Hajin.
Everyone see if I stand right here? All right, great. So I'm Hajin. Thank you for the introduction. I am a 5th-year PhD candidate in the EIPER program, which some of you may know is it's an interdisciplinary program here in the they just changed the name, but I'll just say Earth Department. I think it's technically Earth System Sciences or something like that. And I study both law and social psychology as it relates to environmental regulations. So before I actually start the talk, Jonathan asked that I give a little spiel on how I got to grad school. So am I okay with that? So I went to undergrad and did my degree in economics. I fell in love with the theory of comparative advantage, Sir Ricardo, and thought trade was just so interesting and so cool. So I studied that. I did my senior thesis on foreign direct investment, and then I graduated and I went to Korea for a gap year, working for a startup and then also taking some Mandarin language classes just for kicks. And during that year, I read this book by Barbara Kingsolver called Animal Vegetable Miracle. And in that book, she talks a lot about the externalities to trade. And I had this environmental awakening where I realized, okay, trade is not this panacea that I thought it was. There are some problems to it. And so I started to care a lot more about these environmental externalities that before I had sort of just said, oh, you know, we can regulate those away. I went on to work for a management consulting firm for 3 years, still trying to figure out what do I want to do with my life, should I be a business person, should I go to law school, do I want to do this academia thing? And I decided I care a lot about this environmental stuff, so policy seems like a good way to get at it. Let me go to law school. So I came here. I had been out of school for 4 years, so I was terrified that I couldn't be a student anymore. I'm happy to say you figure it out again, even if you take a long gap. And in my first year of law school, I had been planning to do a joint program here with the EIPER program for a master's, so I could just do the law degree and the master's. But in that first year, I realized I want to spend more time in classes, and I actually want to do research that I don't think I will have time to do if I try to finish both degrees in 3 years or 3.5 years. So I applied to the PhD program, and that is why I'm now doing this joint degree. So I finished my law degree in 2014. I took a year off to clerk, which is just working for a judge. I came back, did a year of the PhD, went back to work for another judge, and I'm now back and finishing the PhD. I'm hoping to defend at the end of this year and then take another year to be on the job market. And I'm hoping to go into legal academia, although I am very happy to be a lawyer somewhere or be a researcher somewhere. I really enjoy both of the degrees that I've fallen into, and think most people here probably would feel the same once you get interested in the sort of work that you're doing. Okay, so about the talk today. Sorry, I'm going to awkwardly signal to Jonathan because I don't have a clicker on changing the slides. So if you could. So the talk today is about a project that I recently started, and the idea is that we tend to think a lot that firms are these super hyper-rational entities that care only about profit and don't care at all about what I would call morality. And in discussing this with a bunch of academics and folks in industry, I wondered whether or not this might be problematic because expectations can be self-fulfilling. So if we expect that firms are always going to maximize profits only, does that mean they are more likely to in fact maximize profits only without considering societal impacts? So when I talk about morality, what I mean is can firms think about something other than their material self-interest, than their bottom line, right? So what I'll go through today is the motivation for this project, a bit on my theory, a bit on a precondition to my theory, which is can firms actually practically and legally be moral, and then finally a few research ideas that I'm playing around with at the moment. So next slide. All right, so sorry. I have animation, so it's going to be especially annoying for you guys. All right, so we typically see pollution or some sort of societal harm, and we think, can you actually click twice? That government is the right institution to deal with this. The government should come up with some type of formal regulation that says pollute less, or here's a charge on your pollution, or you can only pollute to this amount, right? And we think that, can you click 3 times? We think when you come to a firm or a corporation, they are subject to those legal restraints. They can only pollute as much as the government tells them. But then, besides those legal restraints, they just make as much profit as they can, right? As they're good corporate citizens so long as they obey the law. The problem, though, is one more. Sorry, thank you. The problem, though, is formal regulation is often inadequate. So there are sort of standard reasons for this. One is that we just don't know everything. So we don't know everything that could be harmful to society, so we can't regulate it. And the second is that, we can leave that up. The second is actually just political feasibility issues, right? So for example, we know that overuse of fertilizer has contributed to dead zones in the Gulf Coast, in Chesapeake Bay, and all of the Great Lakes, like all of these bodies of water. But the agricultural lobby is so powerful that states and the federal government have never been able to adequately control this overuse of fertilizer, right? And there are 2 economic trends that have exacerbated this regulatory failure. So the first is the industry consolidation. So over the past several decades, companies have been merging so that in most industries in the United States, the biggest companies are now a bigger share of each market, right? And what that means is that each company has more power, and so it's easier for them to lobby, right? The collective action problem in lobbying for different regulations is lessened when there are fewer of you. Then globalization can also be tricky, right? So as trade barriers have come down, we know that the distribution of production is now all across the world, right? Like this t-shirt may have been, the cotton maybe from Brazil, the threading might have happened in Bangladesh, and so on and so forth. And when that happens, what that means is that a lot of the economic activity that we engage in as consumers in developed countries might have a lot of environmental impacts in foreign countries. And in those foreign countries, it's hard for our governments to intervene because governments don't like to regulate extraterritorially. There are also potential WTO challenges for trying to do so. And finally, a lot of the issues today are just global in nature. They require international coordination. So climate change is an obvious one. Fisheries, plastic pollution in the ocean. A lot of these things, if you want formal governance to take care of it, you need the governments to actually get together and work together. And we just haven't seen all that much strong progress on that front. But these 2 trends may, paradoxically, actually favor informal regulation. And by informal regulation, what I mean is social influence, so voluntary actions that companies might take. This is either through, just by themselves, so corporate social responsibility commitments, or as part of consortiums, or, they might try to get certified through eco-certification programs. So things like, you may have seen like the Fair Trade label, or the MSC label, or FSC label for seafood and fisheries. And the reason why these trends might favor that is for industry consolidation. I guess let me start with so EDF, Environmental Defense Fund, has an office in Bentonville, Arkansas. Does anyone know why that might be relevant?
Walmart?
Exactly. Walmart is in Arkansas. And so why does EDF have an office there? Because they can influence Walmart. And if you can influence Walmart, you can make a huge change without any formal government regulation, right? And so if you talk to like the heads of WWF or any of these other environmental nonprofits, what they're doing now is they're working with these big corporations so McDonald's, Walmart, Costco, all of them have pledged to only buy MSC certified seafood. And it's much easier because of the industry consolidation to just work with those players than to work with 100 smaller players, right? Then we have also globalization. So the benefit of globalization, and this is morally a little tricky, but the benefit is that developed country consumers and markets may influence environmental regulations in a positive trend in developing countries, right? So what I'm trying to say by that is if you look at the types of crops in developing countries that are being produced, that are certified, it's things like coffee, palm oil, cocoa, things that are destined for export markets. Because developed country consumers are in some cases demanding more of these types of these certified, better produced products. But if you look at what's not certified in those countries, it's things that are destined for the developing country market, within market consumption. So things like rice, maize, and so forth. And so globalization can help in the sense that it provides a lever through all of these supply chains into these areas, into these developing countries where there's a lot of environmental impacts happening. And we know that informal regulation is a really big deal. So you can just click all the way through, actually, and then stop. Okay. So Weaving Business is, so we know, of course, President Trump is trying to pull out of the Paris Climate Accords, but Weaving Business is, 800 or more companies that have pledged to do something on climate. There is, I think, 40% of the coffee now produced in 2016 or something like that was certified sustainable. MSC, the Seafood Sustainability Certification, I think it has 14% of all wild catch in aquaculture, and I think 20% of wild catch is now certified sustainable. So a lot of these certifications are growing really, really rapidly. So informal regulation is now is sort of filling this vacuum of regulatory inaction that we have, right? And there's lots of reasons to think that this is all within the self-interest of the companies involved, right? But a lot of people, when I talk about this, will also say, sorry, you can pull up the last thing, that firms just can't, it has to be about the firm's self-interest. It can't be that the managers of these firms, the people making these decisions, that anything about is a moral decision. So they say things like, oh yeah, it is because of consumer demand. And of course, some of it might be because of consumer demand. But how many of you knew that MSC or McDonald's only buys sustainably certified seafood? Yeah, very few of you, right? So really, is that consumer driven? I mean, you guys are all actually you guys care a lot about the environment. That's why you're in this class, and even amongst this crowd, few people know, right? Other people say, oh, no, it's a regulation avoidance tactic. So we think regulation will come down the line, and if we go a little bit, then we can forestall regulation that will force us to go even further. And surely that's part of the case as well, but a lot of the regulatory, it seems implausible that there will be regulatory action on a lot of the things that corporations are doing voluntarily. So how many of you think that under a Trump administration we'll get any action on climate that isn't reversing things that President Obama's administration put in place? Yeah, it's not going to happen. I mean, I hope I'm wrong, but it's probably not going to happen. I think the most likely self-interested story here for firms is that they're trying to avoid crazy brand risk. So in the 1990s, Nike was famously dragged through the mud because everyone started to do these exposés on their sweatshops and their labor conditions. And so lots of companies don't want to be exposed for having horrendous conditions, either for labor issues or for environmental issues. And so that might be a plausible self-interest story. But I wondered, is there something that we're losing? Is there something bad that's happening because we are constantly looking for and only accepting a self-interested story, as opposed to thinking that maybe corporations can be trying to do good here? And so I started thinking about this and looking into the literature. And the reason why I think it matters is because expectations can be self-fulfilling. So to give a few examples, bubbles, right? Like the housing bubble before the crazy crash, or maybe we're in a housing bubble now. How does it work? I think that if I buy a house now, it'll be worth like $100,000 more next year, so I feel comfortable buying it. And then you think the same thing, so you go buy a house as well. And because we're all buying all these houses, the bubble is self-perpetuating, right? And so the expectation of house prices going up leads to house prices going up, right? Growth mindset. So Carol Dweck on this campus has done a ton of work on growth mindset, which basically says kids who believe that intelligence is a fixed trait will tend to perform at those fixed levels of intelligence. But kids who tend to believe that they can grow their intelligence through work and effort tend to, in fact, grow their intelligence. And so this is another expectations lead to reality type result, right? How many of you know what the prisoner's dilemma is? Okay, looks like most of you. So for those of you who don't know, it's essentially this idea. So let's say that it's based on this premise of there's two, let's say they work together at a robbery, and they're held in separate cells, and the police go to them and they say, okay, you can't talk to the other guy, but I want you to confess to me if you did it or not. And if they cooperate with each other, if they both stay silent, then they both get together they're pretty good. They both get 2. If they defect though, and tattle on the other, if they tattle and the other one cooperates, they're in great shape because now, they're like, oh, we have somebody who's gonna rat out this other guy, and so they're gonna get 3. But if they both tattle on each other, then it's not like the police get anything extra from the fact that you tattled on the other guy. So you each get 1, right? And the whole incentive structure basically suggests that everybody always wants to defect, because if the other guy cooperates, you do better if you defect. And if the other guy defects, you again do better if you defect. And it's a symmetrical system, right? So everybody wants to defect. So a rational actor here would defect, and both actors would defect. But what was really interesting is, well, one, when people play out the prisoner's dilemma, there are cooperation rates much higher than you would expect, so much higher than 0. But even more interestingly, when researchers called it either the Wall Street game or the community game, there were much higher levels of cooperation under the community game than under the Wall Street game, right? So calling it the Wall Street game made people think, oh, I'm supposed to be self-interested here, so I should defect. And calling it the community game had made people think, oh, I'm supposed to, be a community member, so I should cooperate, right? So this is another way expectations can lead to different results. And finally, of most relevance to my work, is the norm of self-interest work that Dale Miller has done here also at Stanford, although I think he was at Princeton when he did the work. So the norm of self-interest work suggests that people act more self-interestedly than they in fact are naturally or feel, because they feel like that's what they're supposed to do. So students in economics classes and economics majors tend to defect more or be less cooperative in a lot of these experimental games than other students. We know that the norm of self-interest leads people to expect less of others. So in one study, they had men and women say, okay, let's say there is a gender-specific disease. How much would you care if it were hitting the opposite gender? And each gender, so if it were like a female-specific disease, men would care, quite a bit, but women would expect them to care not very much, right? And the same thing happened in the reverse. And not only that, not only does it lead you to expect less of others, it leads you to act less cooperatively. So when you have people playing either in groups or individually, what they found is, again, similar to in prisoner dilemma-like setups, individuals would cooperate at higher rates when they're playing by themselves. But when they're playing with a group, and when their results impacted the group, they played less cooperatively. And they found that this was because, in part, of their expectation that other group members would want them to play less cooperatively. So the whole idea is the norm of self-interest suggests that self-interest in itself can be a self-fulfilling idea. Because we teach that self-interest is supposed to be, in economics classes and so forth, it is appropriate and just normative and virtuous, more people act in that manner. So that's obvious parallels for what I'm looking at, right? So my theory is that maybe this is happening with corporations, and the idea that corporations are profit maximizing only, right? And to sort of flesh this out for you, let's say there is, we're looking at what the range of decisions that a company can make, right? And so let's say that the x-axis is private benefits and costs, and the y-axis is public benefits and costs. And what you'll see is if there is a profit maximization norm, everything in the shaded green is sort of up for grabs for the company, right? It doesn't matter whether or not it's good for the public or bad for the public. It's good for the company, so they'll be okay doing that, right? Now, let's add in a legal constraint. So this is obviously very stylized, but the reason why this is if you add in a legal constraint, I'm arguing that what happens is the stuff that is the worst for the public and the least costly for the private, that's why it's a triangle, is probably the stuff that is likely to become illegal, right? So it's worse for the public, so the public is going to agitate to take this off the table, and it's least costly for the private, so companies are going to be the least resistant to having this being taken off the table. And so we'll say, okay, you can't do that, right? Now, on the next slide, I said, well, okay, so that was A, B, and C, right? But what if it's actually through social influence we can get to D and E? And what I mean here is, what if there are things that are not actually illegal, but we think are pretty bad for the public and not so profitable for private actors? Can we get companies to take them off the table because we are just influenced, we expect them to act better. We expect them to, not do these things. And because of those expectations, can those things actually become unprofitable, right? This is basically shifting the axis, right? And the same token, by the same token, E is, okay, there are things that we think are probably pretty good for society and not super costly for private actors to do, and do we think we can put those on the table and make those more profitable to do? So things like a corporate sustainability report, which many, many companies do now. It's not super costly to do. So many of them are doing it now, and I've never seen a profit analysis, but one could argue investors and consumers and employees now expect that, and so it could actually be net profitable for them in the long run, right? Okay. So that's how I think expectations might be able to play out into how companies make decisions. But for that to work, for people to expect companies to be potentially moral and not just profit-seeking, we have to assume that they can be, right? And the first point that I want to make is, economists always have these very clean models based on assumptions that people are rational and that they are self-interested and so forth. Behavioral economics has really added a ton of nuance to that, and so we know, for example, that people don't, make the perfect calculations, they're subject to framing biases and so forth. But we also know that people are actually more altruistic than a lot of the bare-bones economic models will give them credit for, right? So we all do, I won't speak for everyone, but many people donate to charity, right? And if you have these sort of dictator games where you say, okay, we're a partner, I'm gonna get, like, you get like $1 and you can decide how much of that dollar to give me. I don't get any say. The totally, self-serving, self-interested thing for you to do would be to keep that dollar. But in fact, in experiments around the world, in small-scale societies, university students, and so forth, we find that most people actually do give something around 30% of that dollar to that other person. So people care about things like fairness and care about others. And with companies, the reason why most people think that companies can't care is often legal. So it's the idea that, okay, the shareholders own the company, they're the residual claimants to the company, and the board of directors and the executives and all the employees, they're basically just agents of those shareholders. And their purpose is to make money for the owners of the company, the shareholders, right? But what's so funny is that people on the left and the right basically all agree that companies are all profit-seeking only. But scholars, legal scholars on both the left and the right, essentially agree that this is definitely an over generalization, and there's several reasons why. So first, corporations can be formed for any purpose, pretty much. And corporate charters are typically very broad. So most corporations are not saying, as they're getting formed, like, we are being formed for the profit of our stockholders. That's not the explicit goal of these companies. Second, the business judgment rule is basically this doctrine in corporate law that says, like, look, it's very hard for me to say whether or not, like, it's very hard for me, a court, to judge whether or not this was a good business decision by you, company. I actually, judges don't have that type of expertise. So we're going to give you a huge swath of discretion and say, as long as there is any plausible reason, you don't even have to give me a reason, as long as there's any plausible reason that this might contribute to the long-term profitability of the company, you're good. Right? So that's a huge protective shield. And then there's a bunch of other doctrines. So there are constituency statutes in something like 33 states that basically say, not Delaware though, which matters a lot because so many companies are incorporated in Delaware, but the constituency statutes say, you can make corporate decisions for constituencies who are not your shareholders. And that matters because, of course, if employees care about wages, or if the community that you're operating in cares about the environment, that means you can take those into consideration. And then there's also benefit corporation statutes, which are a little different, but because they mandate you to care about social impact, but you have to actually have to incorporate under the benefit corporation statute. But in any case, what the legal scholars all agree on is, for all practical intents and purposes, the business judgment rule shields you if you want to do a socially beneficial thing, and you can't prove, or even come close to proving, that this will benefit you in the long run. So, what is my research on? So that was all the theory that I basically have put forth. My research is now I want to actually test out, do changes in expectations of corporate behavior change both corporate decision-making itself and also evaluations of those decisions? 5 minutes? Okay. I'm basically done. So I'm considering the influence of different prescriptive norms and different legal regimes to see if those essentially change how people approach these decisions and how people evaluate companies making these decisions. So yeah, that's where I'm at. I think that's it.
Cool. So we have the rest of the time now for Q&A. So we'll leave it up to Hajin and you guys.
Do you have specific types of companies that you want to look at? No, so this is all very abstract. So I was doing an interview project where I was looking at retailers, because retailers are at this interesting inflection point where, they face a lot of consumer pressure, and we know from other research that consumer-facing companies tend to do more of these sort of CSR-like activities, but they also operate with a lot of suppliers, and so Walmart has lots of these retailers have supplier codes of conduct and other contracts specific with their suppliers to say we want to do specific things. So I was working on an interview-based project based on retailers, but this stuff is purely based on, corporate managers broadly, lawyers broadly, and lay people, anyone essentially.
So CSR isn't necessarily environmental per se, right?
No.
And I think for a lot of people, like the environment seems fairly abstract in their daily lives, and they might care more that corporations, like aren't abusing sweatshop workers, for example, right? Or like more specifically human things. So is there any reason to believe that like the environment would benefit disproportionately to other CSR-like activities, or are you just interested in this because like you care about the environment and it would also benefit?
I don't think it's disproportionate. It is very trendy, trend specific. So it's just like whatever the hot topic is of the day, corporations tend to react to. So for example, this is why everyone's sort of aflutter about plastic straws, right? Because it's just there ended up being momentum around it, but there isn't the same momentum currently around some animal welfare or like labor violations. I mean, there is still slavery in a lot of these supply chains, right? So, and there are people who agitate a lot on those issues, but it's actually just hasn't grabbed the national consciousness the way plastic straws have for the moment. So it just depends on how you get the national conversation going.
Mm-hmm. And then within the environmental like sphere, do you see particular issues as sort of like having been or emergently being more dominant than others? Like, is it like more
climate
animal
and
rights?
plastics right now are
Climate
huge.
plastics, okay.
Yeah.
What's your opinion on so-called ESG integration into financial decision making for, I guess, like positive, sustainable outcomes?
Yeah, ESG right now is huge. I just looked at something that said that something like 20% of the professionally managed funds in the U.S. now employ an ESG screen.
What's ESG?
Oh, sorry, environment, social, governance screen. So basically, they take environmental factors, social factors, governance factors, and they say like, okay, do the companies that I'm interested in investing in, do they pass the sort of bare bones screen that I care about using these factors, right? So the way I thought about it so far is that it's an indication to me that investors now are caring and thinking that companies can care about these other about these other societal factors. I haven't actually looked into ESG screens specifically enough to say like, oh, is this a really good screen? Like, how robust is it? Does it actually change corporate behavior? Things like that. But for me, it's at least a market signal.
Yeah, and just like a follow-up question, like have you looked at, or are you gonna look at like, I don't know, like green bonds or like socially responsible bonds? Because I feel like that might be like, I don't know, like a motivational factor for these corporations to like take on sustainable projects, seeing that they get, like money for it.
Yeah, I think that could be a fantastic motivational factor. I think my understanding is that market is still small, but maybe growing. But yeah, I'm not going to look at that. I'm not planning to look at that specifically, but it is definitely an input into how, so what I didn't talk about is, so how would this all sort of flow to the corporation and change our decisions? And so I think it's really, consumer demand to some extent, although from what we discussed before, like it's not going to be the whole thing. Employees to some extent, there's a lot of surveys coming out now saying millennials want to work for socially responsible companies, or at least don't want to work for socially irresponsible companies. And the third piece is of course investors themselves, who are now starting to show that they care on some level about these things. The jury's still out on whether or not these ESG screens and there's a lot of debate over whether or not this stuff will end up being more profitable or less profitable. And so what it seems like right now is happening is the very good stuff is profitable, and the very bad stuff, the sin stocks, I think, like tobacco, firearms, both of them are essentially outperforming the market a little bit. And so people are still trying to figure all of this out.
Your graphic suggests that trade-offs between the public and private sphere are zero-sum. Does it have to be the case?
I actually don't think it suggests that. So because in the top right of the graphic, that's the win-win opportunity, right? And so I don't think that has to be the case. I happen to think about negative externalities and positive externalities more because I think it's more interesting. Although it's totally true, there are a lot of win-win opportunities that once you change a company's framework and make them think about them, they suddenly realize they can take. So 3M's pollution, it's a 3P program. It's pollution pays something. There's another P. Basically saved 3M a ton of money because they were able to reduce the waste in their production, right? So there's definitely tons of win-win opportunities on the table.
Yeah, so one critique of certain corporate sustainability efforts is they've been called greenwashing, and that like the company for its branding attempts to show it's sustainable but then doesn't actually do anything impactful. Have you looked into like how often that occurs, or if that's only in a few cases with companies?
So companies now, it depends on who you ask. So there, I think TerraChoice or TerraSurvey, I can't remember exactly what they're called. They basically show that it's rampant, right? But you also see, in fact, that a lot of companies are doing stuff that nobody knows about. So they're not even getting credit for a lot of the things they're doing. And there's also an interesting phenomenon called brownwashing, where certain industries will downplay their environmental achievements because they realize that there is a sort of backlash from investors. Because investors will sometimes think, oh, if you're doing this environmental thing, it must be more costly, right? So I think it's still such a changing field. Of course, greenwashing is really bad, and that hurts this whole effort. But I think companies now realize if it's very obvious that they're greenwashing, they're going to get, their reputation is going to be screwed. I mean, it's interesting because SC Johnson, I think, got in a lot of trouble for its greener chemicals, some sort of cleaning supply line, but SC Johnson actually does a ton on the environment as well. I think it was essentially a PR misstep, even though they are doing other stuff on the environment that is substantive and good. So it's hard, right? Because you're in the court of public opinion where, it just isn't any nuance. But it's also good because you want to police that and make sure people aren't, in fact, greenwashing.
Have you seen any trends in organizational positioning of sustainable champions? For example, we heard from in another class of Google's sustainability chair,
Yeah.
and she was reporting to the CFO.
Yeah.
Earlier, that wasn't the case. We are curious on how has the positions of sustainability initiative in charges has changed, or also how has it permeated across the organization?
Yeah, there's a lot of debate about that right now. Like, should you have it like a separate CSO, a chief sustainability officer, or should you have it embedded in the values of everybody in the organization? And you can see pluses and minuses to both. I don't know that I have seen, what I have seen is there are a lot more CSOs. I think it's much easier for companies to say we're doing something if you have a CSO, or something equivalent or similar to that title. And typically a CSO is obviously C-level, so they're, essentially working with a CEO. But yeah, there's like many different models. So for example, Paul Pullman at Unilever, which is a company that's famously doing a lot on the environment, he himself is the sort of evangelist for environmental initiatives at the company. And so I think it just really depends.
Just a quick follow-up to that. Do you know like how many meetings in a week does a CSO get versus a CFO or another leadership member?
Oh,
Because a lot of times they may report to the same person, but you may not.
But they might not have the same visibility. I don't have a good sense. From some of my interviews, I think there's just a lot of variety. So one company I know, this person met with the CEO probably every day, and then others, they weren't even C-level, so they had like a whole higher reporting structure. And a lot of the times, sustainability, to your point on greenwashing, sustainability executives, or not even executives, sustainability folks will be placed in the communications department, where they just have a lot less leverage, and it's much more about packaging than it is about, changing. So then you also have, in a lot of these places, you'll have separate sustainability teams placed in the supply chain and through like their sourcing and production lines, but it is much more dispersed, and they don't necessarily always roll up to somebody who works directly with the CEO. But I don't know actually any data on the frequency of meetings. It's an interesting question.
So, I'm still trying to figure out exactly how to formulate this, but you're talking about just kind of the role of our expectations for corporations changing. And I think part of the generation we've grown up in, we don't expect a lot of regulation to come out in general. And so I mean, I guess in a broader vision, do you think corporations will fill that role kind of in the long run?
You know, I don't know. The purpose of this project is essentially to tell people, given that we aren't seeing a lot of formal regulation, shouldn't we be trying other avenues of influence? I don't know how successful it will be, but I have to say I'm surprised by how much has happened. So I'm surprised that 40% of the coffee grown is certified sustainable. And by the way, only 25% of that is sold certified sustainable. So only 25% gets that price premium, small as it may be. And so I think there are reasons to be optimistic. Ultimately, my personal belief is that there are lots of intractable problems that, you know, you just want formal regulation to step in and solve. So I don't know. I do think if we have a change in administration that we'll see a lot more action. But
What sort of issues do you think are not impossible, but there's no way to work around? Like we would have to abandon that way of working or that industry and find a complete alternative instead of finding a way to change that industry. Are there any
interesting.
particular-
I don't know that there's any one industry that I would say, you know, like death to that industry. I mean, I think a lot of people in the environmental space would probably talk about fossil fuels, but I actually just read a report that said something that, I know this is anathema to many, but apparently carbon capture has gone down to something like, I want to say it was some double-digit number per ton, which was unheard of before. And so, you know, if you have like really, really good carbon capture, then fossil fuels may not actually be so terrible either, right? So I don't know that I can say that there's one thing. I mean, there are issues that I think you should never have slavery, right? That's easy. No workaround, don't do that. So there are things like that, but I don't know that there's like an industry-wide, like an industry that I would say that industry should no longer exist.
Or any like particular product?
Well, I was really happy that there's a federal ban on microbeads now, so those are the like plastics and cosmetics, because what's the point? Just use like crushed walnut shells or something so the fish don't eat all this plastic. I mean, things like that. There are a lot of things like that. Yeah.
Do you think that perhaps there might be a downside to portraying it as self-interest versus morality? Because it seems as though any reasonable coffee company can and should be interested in sustainable coffee, and any food company should be interested as a result of self-interest in perpetuating the fish supply. So I feel as though if you're trying to discuss these issues with people who are more aligned with the side of, you know, let's say Trump, for example, you're going to fall on deaf ears if you paint it as a morality issue as opposed to if you paint it as a self-interest issue.
Yeah, so I think that's a fantastic question, and I think it is both, right? So in the graphic that I had up there, I say self-interest and morality because it's easy to have a dichotomous, but of course they're not. The graphic suggests, in fact, that like the stuff that it will become in the company's self-interest to care more about the societal impacts that we traditionally think of as outside of their self-interest, right? So I definitely think that it should be part of this, like this should be part of why companies care, because it will become, if we think that companies can care about societal impacts, then it will be in their self-interest, in fact, to care about societal impacts, right? Because if we have, like, so the idea is, I actually don't know what her discipline is, but there's an academic who says that norms are a cluster of self-perpetuating expectations. And so I think if you have the expectation that companies will behave morally, then consumers, employees, and investors will punish them for not behaving morally, and so it will just be in their self-interest. Does that make sense? I also think that, and I should be more careful about how I talk about this, profit seeking in and of itself should not be considered an evil either, right? Because as companies make profits, they employ more people, they grow, they stimulate the economy. There are lots of very useful societal benefits to all the activities that these corporations are doing. So I also don't want to alienate people either. So if I did that, then that was not intended.
How do you think these trends in changing the ways in which companies like react in terms of self-interest and ethicality and also the environment, how do you think that would relate to like consumption and consumers? In that like a lot of people have been saying in terms of the environment as a consumer to just consume less. So how would those two things sort of interact or?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I think that's a huge deal right now in fast fashion, for example. So a lot of companies are trying to think of ways of like, oh, can we, recycle the material so that you can still have fast fashion and sort of consume and like get the newest trends, but then like know that it'll be like a closed circular loop, things like that. And it's an inherent tension. So Walmart has done a ton on the environment, right? Just green fleets. Like it's now working with farmers to reduce fertilizer use, something that state and federal governments can't do. All this stuff, but it still gets a lot of criticism because its inherent model is to push out a ton of cheap goods for people to just use and throw away. So it's a real tension. I think there are a lot of companies who recognize that and are trying to think, how can we become more circular? So Janine, I don't know how to pronounce her last name, the woman who wrote about biomimicry, she came and gave a talk on campus, and she talked a lot about, how one way you could make this circular, totally circular, is like, let's say you had a shoe that was all actually made out of the same material, and but you can essentially lay down the material in different ways, so you have like hard parts of the shoe and soft parts of the shoe, and then you can just go to your local shoe store, unzip it with one enzyme, and then recreate, 3D print like a new shoe out of that. So things like that, people are really trying to figure out like, okay, can we get into something like that so that we can encourage the consumption that keeps our economy going and so forth, and of course the company going, but do it in a more sustainable way. But yeah, it's a great question. Okay.
I've heard a lot about companies changing, like I feel like these are established companies, and I'm just wondering if a new company were starting up right now, do you think they would start out with this mindset, or would they develop this mindset later?
Oh, interesting, because, so you're saying like, do you think that they will sort of use this as their own like niche and their strategy, or will they first establish themselves and then become more sustainable? I think there are both models happening, right? So Allbirds and Rothy's, for example. So Allbirds is a shoe company. They use sustainable wool and eucalyptus and so forth. They basically said, we're going to show the shoe industry that you can sustainably produce shoes. Of course, their marketing, which is interesting, is more on comfort than on sustainability, because they think sustainability does not sell. And Rothy similarly is about like, oh, you can wash these new cute flats that we make and they're so comfortable and stretchy, but they're made out of recycled plastic bags. So you have that type of model where a lot of these newer companies are saying, well, we can innovate and find a cooler, more sustainable way of doing this. But I'm sure you also have other companies that are just saying, oh no, we just have to establish some market dominance first. And then once we become a really big player, we'll start to attract the sort of PR attention that might look bad if we're not doing all the right things. So then we'll sort of get religion and figure out how to, produce things better. So I think you will have both models.
This isn't on this because it's early, but can you talk about your thesis, like what you have been doing since you're about finishing?
Sure. So I have 3 projects. The first is on this idea of moral tests and moral opportunities. So this is very social psychology. So a moral test is something you feel obligated to do but don't feel very good for doing. So something like not cheating on a test. Whereas a moral opportunity is something you feel very good for doing but you don't feel like you have to do. So that's something like donating to charity or donating a kidney or something. And so I'm sort of working with collaborators to sort of tease out like, what happens under each. Are these true empirical patterns that we're seeing? And then if they are, what are the implications of these patterns? It's one chapter. I have another chapter on essentially cap and trade versus pollution taxes or other types of taxes. Economists will say they're fundamentally equivalent under certain assumptions, and I'm trying to understand, are they psychologically different because one regulates price and one regulates quantity? And then this is part of my 3rd chapter on corporate morality. So, yeah.
Just a quick question. Do you see a change in trend in which companies are viewed as a collection of individuals rather than like entities? That they're they are held morally responsible like humans?
If they consider themselves more to be a collection of individuals, so more like a collective as opposed to like a corporate structure?
Yes, more like a collection of individuals rather than an entity which is like not supposed to be held responsible for moral behavior.
That's a really interesting question. I haven't actually thought about that. I know there's a bunch of work now that's just starting on whether it matters and how it matters if a company thinks of itself as a societal actor as opposed to just, just about like, oh, all we care about is, how to make money. I don't know if corporate attitudes within the company vis-a-vis the employees and, hierarchy and things like that, I don't know how much that matters. I just haven't looked at it. It's an interesting question though.
Well, it's
Alright.
just about time, so let's give one more round of applause for Adam. Yeah, if you have any more questions, feel free to just come on back.
Thanks everyone. Thank you.